A few years ago, I saw a bit of research that said that your average 5-year-old gets 341 negative inputs in a day. That's things like don't put your finger in a power socket, eat with your knife and fork, not your hands, those kind of things. Probably things that you would say are pretty reasonable when you think about it. But 340 negative inputs per day as opposed to 16 positives. So 16, we love you, you can do it, have another go, that kind of thing. Interesting when you think about that, really the numbers don't matter so much, except that the proportions of them. Because you see, we are taught to think at that level. We're taught to react the same way. So if as an adult, you have the average 60,000 thought streams in a day, remember that, 60,000 thought streams in one day. If they're in the same kind of proportions we just talked about, even if they're 50-50, we've got a problem. Because what it does, it teaches us to be hypercritical of ourselves. We've become extremely judgmental of ourselves. So most people's self-talk, most people's kind of thought streams focus around judgment, focus around finding blame, sort of tend towards regret about things I've said or done in the past, fear about what might happen in the future, recrimination for things that I've said and done, and guilt and shame about those things, and essentially a focus on the negative consequences of what happens when we have those thoughts. So when I go into the past and I remember something that I said that I shouldn't have said or that I wish I didn't say, and I'm experiencing the guilt or shame, we can say, okay, well, that's not really good for you. I'm going to suggest to you it's kind of like ultra bad for you. And the reason behind that is what happens is when I remember something that I said or did that I wish I never said or did, what happens is my body responds to it as if it's actually happening today. And what I mean by that is that, if I was embarrassed at the time, then as I remember it, then what's going to happen is my heart rate's going to accelerate, my body temperature's going to go up, I'm going to have all the normal reactions that I would have had to the shame or the guilt as if it was actually happening right now. What that means is the thing gets repeated. And because it gets repeated, then I have repetitious experience of it. In other words, it's reinforced, reinforced, reinforced. So I don't really have that one experience of feeling, ashamed or guilty about what I did. I've had it multiple times. The good thing happened once. So what happens is there's this mental scoreboard in my mind, and basically there's good things I've done, the successes that I've had, the times when I've stood up and been the man that I wanted to be, and there's the bad things I've done. Those are the times when I've folded or I escaped on my values or failed to turn up for my values or said or did things I didn't want to say or do. So there's a mental scoreboard of the good and the bad. When you look at that, the good's like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The bad is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 432. And so these things that are negatives tend to get reinforced in the way that I previously described. We tend to remember them and go over them. The things that are positive tend to get undermined because, I stopped smoking about 35 years ago, maybe 36 or 37 years ago. And I suppose from when you think about that, I wasn't a smoker for very long. But in terms of that being a goal or an achievement, you'd say at the time it was a big deal. I remember the stress and the drama, but I don't think about it much anymore. And so what happens is what should be a victory, no, it doesn't count anymore. The time when, my mother-in-law lived with us for 25 years. She passed away in 2006. That's, better than 14 or 15 years ago now. So she hasn't been with us for a long time. I don't tend to remember the 25 years of supporting her and looking after her and giving her the best part of her life. I tend to kind of like it's gone. I remember her fondly, but the doing a good thing is kind of it's not on my list of good anymore because she hasn't been around for a long time. And so what happens for our good list, our list of goals we've reached, the targets we've met, is that it tends to fade away, but the bad stuff tends to kind of keep going. And I gave a speech at a wedding many years ago, probably close to 40 years ago, that was just a horrible speech. It was careless, it was thoughtless, it didn't mention some key people, it was just awful. And I think it was back in the days when my ego couldn't be jumped over and couldn't see that I wasn't perfect. Boy, I hate remembering that. But every time that I'm driving around on a Saturday or Sunday and I see a wedding car go past, with the white ribbons on it, I'm reminded of that horrible speech that I gave. And so I relive the embarrassment and the shame again. So that kind of, has been there for many, many years, staying alive and vibrant. Whereas the good thing, as I said, tends to kind of vanish. What is the solution? Well, essentially, if you understand that your brain runs on the fuel that you give it, and what we're tending to do is we're tending to focus on the negative fuel. What we need to do is counteract that. Seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but what you need to do is make up a mantra that you repeat to yourself deliberately, say half a dozen times a day. I say half a dozen times a day because some days it's going to be twice, and some days it's going to be none, and other days you're going to need it 10 times. I'm going to say my mantra to you so that you can get an idea of the sort of things that should be in it. But don't copy it, right? Because it's not for you. You need to design your own mantra, because if you don't, then you kind of just copied one that sounds good and just doesn't have the feel to it. So what I say to myself, both in my meditations and during the days when I need it, is I give thanks for this day to the Great Spirit, whose presence and perfection I can feel within and without. I'll still my thoughts and feelings in order to practice the 6 perfections of generosity, wisdom, discipline, patience, effort, and compassion. May my heart be lightened and my mind awakened so that I experience genuine health, wealth, and happiness. Now, it takes a little bit to remember. I remember when I first wrote that out, there were several versions, didn't fit. That was the one that I liked. You may hate it. It doesn't matter, because you need yours. But just fiddle around with it and get it so that it feels right to you, and then repeat that as many times as you possibly can. The more often you repeat that, the more often you talk about the goodness within you, the character that will overcome the circumstances that you find yourself in, regardless of whether those circumstances are good or bad. You know, we're all going to have good days and bad days, good times and bad times. The character that we are needs to ride above the good and the bad, so that people know us for who we are, not what we're going through. That's what's really important. So give the mantra a shot.